Hey, hello, and welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. I'm Virginia Prescott from GPB and your host for these talks. Tonight, I am talking with Justine Cowan about the secret life of Dorothy Soames. The memoir follows Justine's problematic relationship with her mother and the posthumous discovery that her mother had not been raised in an aristocratic British family, as Justine was led to believe, but suffered extreme deprivations and abuse as a child in a London foundling home. It is part fascinating history of the home and part personal reckoning. The book was just out and was reviewed in today's New York Times and was chosen by the editors of the book review as a What to Read Now pick. You can purchase it directly from Acapella Books at the link in the chat that's to the right of your screen, and also at the link provided on the History Center's website. So as Justine and I are talking, please do submit your questions. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will try to integrate as many of them into the conversation as possible, or as time allows. Justine Cowan is an attorney and an environmentalist who spent more than 2 decades exposing corporate corruption and holding polluters accountably, often in rural Georgia. She lives with her husband in Atlanta, and The Secret Life of Dorothy Soames is her first book, just out today. Justine, congratulations and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, glad you're here. So this is a daring book in many ways. You began not long into the book saying, "I didn't love my mother," you write, "but I cried when she died." And that's not something that a lot of people are willing to admit. But we see that strained relationship right from the jump, apparent in the scene that opens the book. You get a call from your father that your mother is acting out again. What happened?
Well, I was at Berkeley at the time. I was 19 years old, and my father called me and said I had to come home and take care of my mother. And this had happened before. And I went home, even though I didn't always know what to expect. And it was a little bit of a scene out of Sunset Boulevard when I look back on it. But at the time, it didn't seem that unusual to me. I walked down the long hallway to my mother's bedroom, and there she was, sitting alone in the dark in her bed, with a notepad in her hand, and she was writing a name over and over and over again in her wonderful calligraphy: Dorothy Soames, Dorothy Soames, Dorothy Soames. And it's a name I had never heard before, and she and I would never speak that name with each other in her lifetime.
Dorothy Soames. You were raised sort of like many people who are raised in houses that I can safely say are affected by trauma, like you're walking on eggshells, never knowing when the next shoe is going to drop. You're in this wealthy Bay Area suburb near San Francisco, and your mother puts on airs as if she grew up in the British gentry. You know, she sort of tiger mommed you into it too, into what you describe as some dystopian version of what aristocratic British childhood would be. So what did that look like for you?
Well, it was really the day would start out early when I was young, and we would start out with violin lessons. And I've actually tried to get all the lessons that I've had in my life. I've had violin lessons, French, tap, ballet. I had handwriting lessons. I had private handwriting lessons. And by the way, I had terrible handwriting, so it didn't stick. But I had a lot of, she was always training me to speak right, manners, whatever it would be. And what became of that is a really paralyzing fear of making mistakes.
Hmm.
And something that has carried on into my adult life, and those who are close to me are aware of it, but it really, as I think we'll discover in the conversation tonight, it really has a different um, meaning, because I was afraid of making a mistake because I wouldn't be this perfect woman or this perfect girl, British girl that my mother wanted me to be. And I thought that she wanted me to be more like her as an adult. When I learned the truth of what her life was like, it took on an odd kind of irony, in which we'll discover more as we talk tonight.
And that is what you discover through a long journey, but it wasn't until like following crumbs 25 years later after seeing her first write Dorothy Soames that you start digging deeper into what you find is the hospital for the maintenance and education of exposed and deserted young children. This is much more commonly known as the Foundling Hospital. You have a photo of it, of the second location here in Berkhamsted. This is northwest of London. And you find this is where your mother was raised. And there's a lot of history of the Foundling Home in the book, including its founding in 1739. Now, before that, we learned in your book that it was not uncommon for thousands of babies to be discarded, along with the trash and sewage, often a year. So,
Yeah.
what was it that motivated a change in the treatment of foundlings, as they were called?
Well, it was really astonishing to learn the prejudice that an entire nation had against these poor, defenseless children. And they literally were thrown into sewers to die. And there was a man named Thomas Coram, who was a shipbuilder, and he had lost his mother at a young age, and he was very compassionate about the plight of these children, and he tried for years and years to protect them and to create a home for them. But it wasn't until Britain was facing various wars and there was actually economic prosperity where Britain needed men to go to sea and they needed young women to clean their homes. And so he made somewhat of a devil's bargain where he decided that it's better to save these children from almost certain death, but then created an institution where they would be raised to basically serve London's ruling class.
Mm. The building blocks of empire, I think you call
Exactly.
them at that point. And the rules for admission were not altogether different by the time that Lena Weston, the woman you discovered to be your grandmother, applied to have her baby admitted in 1932. There's a photo that you found in the copy of the rules that were mailed to your mother. You found
Yes.
that in her file. So what were broadly were some of the rules, and what did they reveal about the regard for unwed mothers? Can we have that picture?
Certainly. Are we waiting for the? Oh, here.
Yeah. There's the home itself in
Yes.
Berkhamsted. These are the rules for the admission of children.
So the rules are fascinating because the institution was started to ensure that these illegitimate children weren't just left to die in the streets. But very quickly, the institution evolved to include a second purpose that arguably became an even more important purpose, and that was to return a woman who had fallen to her prior position in society. And the rules reflected that mission. And so these are actually the rules that were in place in the 1800s, but they were also in place in January of 1932 when they were given to my grandmother. And these are actually the rules that were given to her, and I've had the chance to hold these in my hand. And as you can see, I'm sure it might be difficult for some of the audience to see, but there's things that say, for example, that no application can be entertained previous to the birth um, of the child, but that the petitions all have to set forth the true state of the mother's case, that she has to show that she's a previous good character, that the father deserted it. There's all these rules here. And there's a little bit there, as I mentioned, on what the child is. They can't be previous to birth and they can't be older than 12 years old. But the rest of the rules are all focused in on the virtue of the woman. It was very important that only virtuous women could give up their child because otherwise they might not be able to return to the place in society where they once were before they were so disgraced.
So what did you learn about your grandmother, the woman, and the decision that she had to make to basically give up her child?
Well, she became pregnant, and there is a rendition of what happened then. She said she met someone in a cafe and became pregnant, and her brother kicked her out because of the disgrace and didn't want anyone in the neighborhood to know. And so she had to make her way to London, and she had nowhere to turn. And so she was really forced to give up her child. There was no, child support or anything like that, and it certainly did not any sort of benefits that were given to children and mothers at that time period were not given to anyone who had a child out of wedlock.
Mm. Yeah, that is something that came across even through the years that you trace how unwed women were treated, or unwed mothers rather were treated. And there is even a point in the progressive era when there are all these benefits extended to, disadvantaged people, but not unwed mothers. It reminded me very much of the discussion about welfare that is often had in this country, that if you support them, you are somehow condoning that behavior.
Yes, and that was something that they thought that if society provided a place for the child that came of this illicit union, then somehow that was going to encourage such illicit unions to happen. And in fact, during even in the 1930s, they had the Mental Deficiency Act, which actually qualified a woman who had had a child out of wedlock as mentally deficient and could be institutionalized just for that reason. Of course, that rule did not apply to the father, just to the mother. And feminism at the time actually carved out unwed mothers in fights for reproductive freedom and all of this, because unwed mothers were considered deficient and mentally deficient.
Yeah. So she had to be screened in, and on some level, for you, it's pretty great that there was a thorough screening process, because there's a lot of paperwork left behind. But what kind of things had to be shown? She had to get three witnesses to attest to her moral worthiness. You found some documentation of that as
Okay.
well. Can we go to the note from Dr. Mackey? There it is.
So, well, how better to find out whether or not a woman is virtuous, but to ask the men in her life, her doctor, her pastor, and her brother. And so all of them were interviewed, had to give written recommendations. And this one is a letter from Dr. Mackey, who was the family physician. And he actually, this line is just astonishing to me. And this is speaking of Lena and whether or not to take in a child, my mother. And this is about Lena. I have never heard the slightest hint or suggestion of any moral turpitude in her character. In fact, the recent lapse came as a great surprise to me. And from what I know of her, I'm pretty certain it will never happen again. And so this is just one example of a fairly extensive dive into the virtue of my grandmother.
Yeah. And to so many other women, I'm sure, who gave up children to the foundling home. But once she did make a case, she had to make a case in front of the Board of Governors after she had the baby. And it becomes a sort of transaction. What did you find about that kind of transactional nature of this relationship?
One thing that's very interesting is that a receipt is given to to the mother once she drops off her child. And I think we do have a photo of that. So here, well, actually, if you can go back one, and I'm going to describe the token here first. So this is actually what a token, which this is a photo from the Foundling Museum. The Foundling Museum is in London. It's just a few blocks from the British Museum. And when the institution first opened, these mothers who were forced to give up their children would leave tokens to make sure that, with the hopes that someday they could come back and get their child. So they would affix little buttons. They would have little sayings. I even saw engravings that said, how much they loved their child. And this is, a little heart that was affixed to a small child, to a baby that was being given up, so that one day they would be able to come back and get their child. Hopefully, that was always the hope. It rarely happened, though. And over time, that turned into a receipt. And so here we have the receipt. And this receipt is the actual receipt that was given for my mother. Wow. And it's the same receipt that was in place for over 100 years. And interestingly, Charles Dickens wrote about it in a well-known article in his periodical that was called Received a Blank Child. And he viewed the hospital in a beneficial way as putting these children to work. And it was also very transactional in nature because they actually, at one point, the governors of the hospital um, valued how much each child was worth to society when they were put to work and put monetary value on it. And so,
Wow, it's so telling. Um, and mothers were pretty much expected just to, cede control. That's it. You've got my child then. But Lena, your grandmother, as you later found, she wrote several letters appealing to see her child and to ask about her child. What kind of responses did she get?
well, she actually she wrote letters for years, asking about her little girl to see if she was all right. And almost without fail, she received probably one or two sentence letter that's typed, that was signed by the secretary of the foundling hospital, with very little information in it. But I was able to travel to London and hold these letters in my hand, and it was so fascinating because each letter was on a different kind of piece of paper. I mean, as if she could anything she could find, and she would write these letters, and the writing was hard to read sometimes, but you could tell that she missed and loved her child, and you could really tell that she was, forced to give her child up, and really regretted that decision.
Yeah. You discovered all this after your mother died, but she, you'd found, had been on similar quests twice. Unbeknownst to you, went back to the Foundling Hospital and looked through her records. They were somewhat limited, what she was able to look at that time. And she gave you her own memoir that you didn't read for 20 years.
Yeah.
Question here from Julie. Did your father know about your mother's childhood?
I do believe that he did. You were just speaking about the memoir that my mother wrote. She sent it to me when I was in my 30s. And by that time, our relationship was so troubled that I put it in an envelope and I put it in the back of a filing cabinet where it would remain unread for about 20, 25 years. But the telltale sign was that it was typed, and I don't think my mother knew how to type. So I have a feeling my father typed it for her. But I also think that during my journey, I realized the shared journey that my mother and father had. My father lost his mother in childbirth. He lost his father to a heart attack when he was young, and he had other losses as well. And so I think that they probably bonded over those losses and their tragic childhoods.
Well, in what she wrote, among the things she recorded was a really detailed memory of being left there at the Foundling Hospital at 5 years old. Absolutely no explanation, just dropped off there from a foster family. So can you explain that? Why was she left there at 5 when she was actually given up as an infant?
Sure. A lot of things that happened at the Foundling Hospital were started in the 1700s through necessity, but then carried on through time. And one thing I've noticed was that the Foundling Hospital, they were a little rigid in how they did things, and things that happened in the 1700s, which may have made sense, were still done 150 years later, even though it could be rather cruel. So when the Foundling Hospital first opened, children were dying at the Foundling Hospital in London, and so they sent them out to be wet nursed in the countryside until they were 5, and then they would be brought back to the institutional setting, and that helped reduce infant mortality. So fast forward to the 1930s, when my mother was given up. She was sent to a foster mother in the countryside who was really, I don't know what her motivations were, but probably just for the payments that they received for raising the child, because she wasn't very kind to my mother. But other children were sent off to foster mothers who actually treated them very well, and they were brought in as part of their foster family. But then at the age of 5, no matter what, no exceptions, the child would be taken from the foster family and dropped off into this institutional setting with no warning, and then just literally pushed through the door. They would go into the door, they would take their street clothes and put them in these brown clothes that were a symbol of shame and poverty. They would shear their heads. I mean, they would really treat them like prisoners. And from that day on, they would receive no love, no tenderness. No one would touch them again except in punishment.
It is just an unbelievable thing to imagine for a 5-year-old child. There's a photo that you got from the dormitory, if we can see that. Um, in your mother's recollections as a quorum girl, that's what she called her little memoir. She compares it to Dickens without the squalor. But you, however, compare it to another fictional creation, the world that was built in Margaret Atwood's A Handmaid's Tale. And I'm wondering about that comparison. Why that?
Well, certainly. So, well, first of all, they're in uniforms that are chosen for their status and station in life, poverty and shame. In this case, it's brown. They're supervised by women in blue, and then above them are the governors, who are all men who oversee the operation. They have to go and they have to march in twos everywhere that they go. It's called crocodile formation, where they go in twos. They have to be completely silent, and every single aspect of their entire lives is regimented and looked and monitored and scrutinized. And when we saw the dormitory there, they weren't allowed to have any color. There were no toys. It was very stark, militaristic environment. And this is where little 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 year olds would sleep. And they weren't even allowed to have a little chest to put their belongings. And it was very stark.
Yeah. And it's fascinating because your mother dressed you similarly. She made little sackcloth shapeless dresses out of brown for you as a child. And so in a way, she is replicating part of the thing that she grew up with that was so difficult for her, as you learn and as she attests to in The Quorum Girl. But she's also in some ways recreating it. So what do you think was going on for her there?
I have thought about that. She dressed me in these brown skirts that she would sew by hand. Though of course, um, my father was very successful, and we could go to a store and buy something or whatever it might be, and these little brown socks and brown shoes, which of course, didn't make me particularly popular in the schoolyard. And it's one of those unexplained things that happened in my life that I just have a little bit more information about why it might have happened. She didn't see it as odd, perhaps.
A couple questions here about whether they're seeing only people are seeing only girls. There were boys and girls, but they were strictly separated. There's a
Yes,
photograph there. This, I think, is on the opening day of the school at Berkhamsted.
yes,
Um,
there were equal amounts of girls and well, generally equal amounts of girls and boys, and it's very regimented. Once a little girl went into the foundling hospital, she would not speak to a boy um, again for years, and this happened even when there were brothers and sisters. Even when they were raised together, like for example, my mother was raised with another foster boy, and they never spoke again while they were at the Foundling Hospital. There's even one instance of twins where there's a boy and a girl and they're twins and they were not allowed to speak to each other.
so it seems inexplicable, even in the 20th century, that this kind of it feels very 19th century or Dickensian to me on some level. What was the principle guiding this idea of emotional deprivation, regimentation? Where did this come from?
Well, my theory and something that my mother also wrote about is that they were preparing these children to be the soldiers and servants of the British Empire. And that's a lonely existence, and there was no need for love and affection, and that's not where they were going. Another possible theory is that the staff, they were also cloistered, and not chosen for their training. And I think they became unhappy, and it just became an environment where they did not want to give any love to the children that were their charges. So there's different theories.
So they excised tremendous physical and emotional abuse on the children. One was particularly sadistic, a Miss Woodward that you write about in the book, that your mother also writes about in her Quorum Girl memoir. Um, what do you want to tell us about the treatment of Miss Woodward and others at the school towards your mother?
Well, Miss Woodward was really an interesting person. And when you go in and look at the foundling hospital records and interviews that lots of foundlings that were there in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, her name comes up a lot, as does the headmistress, Miss Wright. Um, she's different in that she was actually quite attractive and beautiful, and she was tall and had red ginger hair, but underneath that, she was vicious, and she would beat a child for just, you know, not paying attention, or would, whispering in line or whatever it may be. And and then there was Miss Wright, the headmistress, that also really just sounded like she belonged in a Dickens novel, who would lock children in closets. And her preferred method of punishment was a leather strap. And everywhere she went, she always had a leather strap with her.
Well, now we know the effect of childhood trauma and attachment disorder, which it sounds like, we know that that happened a great deal in the Eastern European countries, in the orphanages there, um, about how that affects a child. And you quote from research from a scientist called, well, we call him a scientist, Harry Harlow, that speaks to that. Could you summarize a little bit of that research and how you think that affected your mother?
Sure. Well, it really goes back to John Bowlby, who came up with it, who was studying attachment theory around the time that my mother was at the Foundling Hospital, but she wasn't able to benefit from his research. Where if a child does not have any love and attention, they're going to have difficulties with attachment later in their life. And it really goes to the theory that a child needs to feel safe to be able to grow and wander, and to go out into the world if they know that they have a safe place, a mother or a father, to go back to, that they have more ability to be strong in the world. And Harlow wanted to prove or disprove that. And so he did experiments with monkeys. And in one circumstance, he had two monkeys. He had several monkeys, and they had two different apparatus. And one was a terry cloth mother, and the other was just a metal structure. And that structure had food, and the terry cloth structure did not. And the monkeys would all go to the terry cloth, and they would clamor around that, looking for what Harlow was trying to prove was love. In another experiment, he actually put these monkeys into solitary confinement, in a sense, and he called it, I can't quite remember the name, but it was horrifying. They were separated from others, and within just a couple of days, the monkeys would be irreparably damaged, and rock back and forth, and it was really horrific. And he was trying to prove that love and affection is an important part of development. His experiments have been criticized as being quite cruel and called into question on whether or not they're ethical.
Right. Dan asked about corporal punishment when it's administered. I think we've answered that. A couple people, Ellen and also Lori, want to know about the quality of the education at the Foundling Hospital.
So they did receive, they were educated, but only on very rudimentary basis. And so not enough information, not enough training to really go out into the world. For example, they were taught math, and about coins and money, but they actually never had coins and money in their hands. So they'd never actually seen it. They'd never seen maps. And so it was very rudimentary. Now, one thing that was interesting was that they were taught to have very good handwriting. There was a lot of emphasis on that, and that was one place where my mother excelled, and the all the foundlings excelled. And I never found a reason why, but I decided that it was maybe because as a lady's maid, you might need to write things for your mistress, but I never really found out why that particular subject was so scrutinized. I mean, so emphasized.
Yeah, reinforced. And for you as well, you said handwriting.
Yes, yes, though it worked with my mother, it did not work with me, so
Well, this is especially traumatizing when you read about the war because she came there in 1932. So, of course, the London Blitz, 1940, 1941, pummeled London, and the environs were pummeled for day after day after day for months by German arms, by German planes, and among the articles that you found was a letter from your grandmother asking for Dorothy, as she was called then, to be released and into her care before the war.
yeah.
So, so did your mother, when she went back and looked for her information, did she see things like this? Did she know that her mother was advocating for her?
So, in terms of the file, my understanding is that she did not get to see these letters. There were privacy concern. There was some privacy laws and policies that before I could see it, I had to prove that everybody involved was deceased. And so, really, the only reason that I was able to see it was because my mother had passed away.
Mhm.
And so, I don't think that she ever saw this letter, but I don't know that for sure. But what's remarkable is that this is during the time when the war was about to break out, and we had what was called Operation Pied Piper. And Pied Piper was one of the greatest movements of people in the United Kingdom, where they basically, mostly children, but it would be children, women, others. They were moved out into the countryside. They were sent to other countries to avoid the bombing that was they knew was about to occur, and in fact did occur in the cities. And so while everyone was being evacuated, my grandmother, of course, thought, well, now is a good time for me to have my child back with me to keep her safe. So I don't want to give too many spoilers, but it was difficult to get a child back once it was given up to the family.
I will say that there are many questions here that are leading to spoilers, which I am trying to avoid in my best possible way. But that was the especially cruel twist here. Children were being sent to Shropshire, specifically where your grandmother was from, and lived in relative rural harmony, as you later found out, for that part of her life. But your mother talks about being there in the orphanage and evacuated and left alone in the infirmary once during a bombing, just terrifying. But your mother was also prone to histrionics and drama. So how did you corroborate these stories? How did you find out what was true?
Well, I mean, that's a good question because my mother had fabricated a version of herself when I was growing up that wasn't entirely accurate. She maybe thought that we were from blue blood and that type of thing. And through my research, I realized that she'd actually also told other people this, that she did fox hunting and the like. Though I'm not sure if she knew how to ride a horse. But I was able to corroborate through a number of ways. I mean, first, there were the words in her memoir, but I traveled to London twice, and I dug into the archives, and a lot of what happened to her was there and memorialized on paper. I also spent some time with her classmates and wandered the halls of the Foundling Hospital, which is now a school um, that is a day school in the area, and wandered the halls with them, talking about what happened. And so I was able to corroborate it that way. And there's also very significant number of interviews with foundlings that were there from the 20s through the 40s and early 50s that echoed a lot of what happened to my mother when she was there.
Yeah, there's a conversation with one of the former foundlings that you meet. They're just some lovely people. I'm thinking Bernice and Lydia. I'm sorry, I can't remember which one it was, but you talk about how you had a really problematic relationship with your mother. And she says something that is just heartbreaking. How could she have known how to be a good mother? And that speaks to something that's also coming up here in the question. How how did you learn to how did you start to see your mother as you were learning about the extreme deprivation that she grew up with?
I mean, it was a difficult journey to take. I mean, I went into this process without any real. I didn't have any goals. It was more of just a compulsion to find out more. And I really disliking my mother was a part of my identity.
Mhm.
And it was anger that I didn't want to carry with me any longer. And then as I went through this process, I began to understand why she was like she was. And I don't want to give spoilers, but I was able to see her in a different light, and but more to understand that a lot of times when there's family dysfunction, there it's a bigger story, and there's a bigger tragedy that happened. A lot of times you hear that someone abuses a child and they were abused themselves, and there's intergenerational trauma. And what you realize is that there's just a bigger story there. And I knew that when I was in the Foundling Museum when I first started this process, and I remember standing in the middle of this room and looking around and realizing that my mother had been part of this just astonishing, cruel chapter in British history. And then I realized that the problems between, my mother and myself were so much bigger than I ever could have imagined. And it wasn't as simple as, blaming each other for whatever slight may have happened.
We have a note here from Lydia. She is one of the people who was a classmate,
Yes.
Lydia Carmichael in school, and a friend of Dorothy Soames. Would like to say that Captain Thomas Coram's idea was that children should be clothed, fed, and educated to a certain standard whereby they could go out to serve the public, which would be far better than being left to die or end up in debtor's prison. Thomas Coram is a hero to us. Unfortunately, 200 years later, in the Berkhamsted School, they had not moved with the times. Corporal punishment was really awful. The basic education we had was not very good, but because we were charity brats, we were not allowed to take public exams. Wow. So how there
So
are several, thank you, Lydia, first of all. But also, this also leads to another question. Like many people are asking, like, how did they get out of there? Where did they go off to? And you do explain that in the book. So I encourage people to look at the book. But often the apprenticeships or their paths out were worse than I think that the experience of being in the foundling home was.
yes, but I have to step back first, and I have to say something to Lydia Carmichael and how wonderful it is that she is here today. I can't see her, but it really warms my heart. Lydia has been a champion on this whole project, and it's a difficult thing to speak about these family secrets um, in public, and to know that my book is going out in the world and people can read it. But Lydia has been brave in telling her story for years, and she's a little bit of a celebrity in England. She's met the Queen, the Duchess of Cambridge, all sorts of people as she's told the story of the Foundling Hospital, and she's been a real hero to me. And so, though the audience can't see her, I hope you all think a warm hug to Lydia for being here tonight. So, which means that now you're going to have to tell me the question again. Um,
I don't know. It's actually the question is, it. How were people equipped to get out of the hut, and how did they, I guess, term out? Were they 18 years old? They didn't know anything about the value of money, even how to take a train. Your mother made her way to the United States. Um, someone else asked, how did your parents meet? So maybe that's how to transition. That's how to rescue my question here.
Well, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but what I will say is that at a certain age, and I believe the age was at about 12, the girls would be sent to a domestic arts um, school where they would fine tune their domestic skills, and then they would be placed with a home where they would work as a scullery maid, a lady's maid, whatever it may be. And for those who like to watch British shows, sometimes you'll note that when they have the upstairs, downstairs scenarios, that sometimes there's orphans, or they'll say that they don't have parents, and that some of the servants have that. Well, that's usually because it's a call out to foundlings, and that's how a lot of those houses were staffed.
Wow. So she did have a successful life in the eyes of many. In the outside world, your father was a very successful attorney, lived in this really nice suburb. You had a privileged childhood by any objective measures. Um, but she was, dragging around this invisible plow her whole life. And what would you think of when she handed you the Quorum Girl? You didn't read it at the time because of the distance you had with your mother. You weren't that interested in hearing more from your mother at that particular point. But what do you think she wanted you to understand about her life at that point?
I think she wanted me to understand where she had come from, and perhaps sometimes when I think back on it, I think of it that it might have been an apology,
Mm.
and a recognition that about the shortcomings that she had as a parent. I also think that it was about her um, trying to claim herself. Um, Lydia, who I was talking about earlier, Lydia um, said that she shouts from the mountaintops. She would shout from the mountaintops that she's a foundling and didn't have that shame. But my mother was not so. She didn't have that strength to get rid of the shame, because when they were raised, I mean, the staff people would tell them that they were shameful, that their births were shameful, and it's something hard to overcome. And so I think that my mother was trying to claim that and perhaps put it in the past.
There was a really a big shift after the war in the treatment of foundlings and regard for children in general. Dan wants to know, has there ever been a study of residents after they left the hospital, how they lived in the world afterwards, after some considerable reforms, and then it was closed in what, 1950s?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well, the question is, there has been, the Foundling Museum did a wonderful program called the Foundling Voices, where they interviewed lots of foundlings to see how they ended up. There's also, I think it's through the University of London, there's a Thomas Quorum research unit that also did a lot of research and has published some of their studies on what happened with the children and the difficulties that they had in adulthood. A lot of times the difficulty is that they weren't equipped particularly as the world changed, and maybe they weren't going to be servants and soldiers and that sort of thing, that they weren't equipped to hold different kinds of jobs. They weren't equipped to have the kind of relationships, marital, getting married and having families and that type of thing. So.
Right, so there's a lot of psychological baggage and even, as you say, epigenetic trauma, like is often passed down from, for example, children of Holocaust survivors. They feel the trauma and they take on the trauma of their parents on some level. Did your mother ever seek counseling? That's another question here.
I am not sure. I did, and there is in the book, I talk about how I wanted her to. But whether or not she did, I'm not sure. She did do some little self-help things along the way, um, but I don't know.
Yeah. So a lot of little habits of, going on strict diets and some hoarding kind of, or hiding or holding on to food, some of these old remnants of the past. Um, a number of people are asking about connecting with your grandmother's family. I know that that's some stuff that is covered in the book, spoilery, but if you want to wrap the relationship with that family, even after contacting them, was somewhat strained, right?
Well, again, I think I want to avoid spoilers. I am not, and I have had a little bit of contact with that side of the family, but nothing meaningful.
Yeah. Is there anything, knowing now your mother had Alzheimer's late in her life at a time when you started to be more interested in asking her big questions, anything that you would like to say to her now?
Uh, you've decided to put me on the emotional spot, haven't you?
Well, it's an emotional book.
Yes, yes, it is. It is. I've thought through that, and I've had people throughout this journey ask me, would I have done it differently? Because I found out a lot of this and had more empathy for my mother, but only after she died. And there is absolutely regret associated with that. Um, and I think back on how it would have been different. But anyone who's been in a dysfunctional family, I think, understands that you keep a certain amount of distance because it's protective.
Mhm.
And I think that being distant from my family allowed me to find a wonderful husband and to have, a really close knit group of friends and all of that. And so I'm not sure that she and I would have really been able to have that conversation.
Yeah.
It's definitely in my mind sometimes, and I try to envision what that would be like. So, but to me, that's part of the tragedy of this story, that decisions were made 200 years ago that impacted the ability of my mother to form a bond. And at the end of the day, there's nothing left to say except that it's tragic.
Yeah.
Um,
Right, there are so many layers of survival here, the self-preservation of and often conflicting with the mother-child bond that we think of as sacred, Lena giving up her child, your mother rejecting shame and inventing a new life to buttress her own self-worth, but lying to her family, and you, the daughter who rejected her critiques and disturbing, let's say, lack of boundaries to pursue your own life. And that does shift in the book in some ways, but you are also putting your past judgment of her out into the world in a book now. And do you fear being judged for that on any level?
well, I think that's one of the reasons that I wrote the book is because throughout my life, I have felt the judgment for not being close to my mother because I think that there are societal shoulds about how you should feel. And, I frequently encountered that, "Oh, she's your mother." And, you would get a lot of that. And, I think we find that whenever there's kind of pat statements and platitudes that they're not particularly helpful when situations are very complicated. Um, I hope that I'm not judged for that. I think that because I've judged myself more for it than probably anyone else would. But I hope that it resonates with people who have had similar feelings themselves. There's probably most of us have somebody in their life that we are supposed to have a certain emotional connection with, but we don't. And you know, I think that that's okay. I think that if I had known more, I may have acted differently at different times. I mean, I think we can all do it. We can go back and look back on our life on all the different scenes that have been played out where you wish you hadn't said this or said that. So
Yeah. Well, we have so many more terrific comments that we won't get to because we do have to close. Um, just want to leave the last word to Lydia, I think. Um, she writes, "This is so sad about dear Dorothy. We all, when leaving school, were so ashamed of who we were, drummed into us that we were charity kids. But as time went on, we changed. Probably some of it due to being members of the old Quorum Association. Those are people who get together and talk about their experience together. We have always been family and have had wonderful holidays together. I wonder if Dorothy had stayed in the UK and joined the OCA, whether, like us, she would have been able to acknowledge pride in being a quorum girl. They still meet 3 times yearly for functions." So a beautiful glimmer of hope. There is a lot of hope in this book and a lot of vulnerability, and I appreciate you sharing some of that with us tonight, Justine. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Justine Cowan is author of The Secret Life of Dorothy Soames. Now, a lot of the questions you ask do get answered in the book, so we do encourage you to buy it. You can support your local bookseller and purchase your copy at the link to Acapella Books on the History Center website, or just go directly to Acapella Books. We thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Tomorrow night, Ed Tarkenton talks with Morgan Babst about The Fortunate Ones. And on Thursday, I'm going to be talking with the New York Times bestselling author Marie Benedict about The Mystery of Mrs. Christie. And this is, of course, about Agatha Christie. And please do join us for the History Center's annual Martin Luther King holiday programming. This week, this Monday, we'll be talking with a panel of guests about the largely untold story of Dr. King's first and extremely consequential arrest and jailing. The first time he was jailed was in Atlanta. You're going to find more Zoom links for all of the upcoming programs at the AtlantaHistoryCenter.com. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and please do come back and listen again.